Imagine a woman in rural India. She's married and she stays at home to look after her 2 children. She wants to set up her own business, but she's never had a formal job before. Her husband's always brought in the finances and controls the finances in the household. So one day this woman goes to a commercial bank to get a loan, but the bank turns her away because she doesn't have any collateral for the loan. Banks in this area aren't used to dealing with women. Usually business transactions are done between men. So this woman goes to another bank. This time the bank is a cooperative bank. A cooperative is a people-centered entity owned and operated by and for its members. It is not private, public, or NGO. It drives for profit and is based on a unique set of principles that ensures that it is run democratically and autonomously. So when this woman goes into the cooperative bank, she realizes that all the bank tellers are women. This is very unusual in India. She asks the bank manager why this is the case. The manager says she's come into a very special type of cooperative, a women's cooperative. The manager said they set up this cooperative because they understand how difficult it is for women to get loans in the traditional banking sector. They understand that in many cases, men control the finances in the household, but women may also want access to finance for their own entrepreneurial activities. So the bank says they can lend this woman the money if she pledges her gold jewelry as collateral. The woman agrees and uses the money to buy the textiles that she needs for her business of making saris.
Despite the potentials of cooperatives as vehicles of development, many of them still face challenges. One example that I personally witnessed tells the story of a small handloom weaver cooperative in Calicut, Kerala, that employs mostly women. So the poor working condition in the factory was the first thing I noticed when I came in. There was lack of ventilation, lighting, or any safety standards. There were more than 30 weaving machines, but I only saw 8 women working who were putting the hard labor creating the textile products. So I asked the director about the poor conditions in the factory and the small number of weavers. However, he seemed uninterested answering questions. In fact, he dozed off a few times during the discussion. So I asked his young secretary, who was eager to engage and more knowledgeable than him. She said that the lack of capital and the intense competition in the market contributed to their cooperative's inability to prosper.
Cooperatives have the potential to break down barriers, to reach beyond formal economy, and to improve the livelihood of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in society. From the first story, you can see what a cooperative can achieve in terms of those development objectives. But we also heard a story about how things could go wrong. Unfortunately, the majority of Indian cooperatives are not achieving their full potential. Just imagine in that second story, what would happen if the cooperative had a better leader? What if they had better access to capital? The questions can go on and on. Built on those inquiries, our research aims to find a comprehensive framework to highlight factors that contribute to cooperative success.
So in creating this framework, we needed to consider how we would define success. The traditional view for cooperatives in defining their success is compliance with what's called the 7 cooperative principles. These are universally acknowledged to be the foundation of the cooperative movement and are guided by our client, the International Cooperative Alliance. They include voluntariness, democratic member control, members' economic participation, autonomy, education, cooperation, and concern for community. But as we went through this work, we challenged the idea that these 7 principles were the only criteria for success. For instance, I don't mention anything about revenue generation. A cooperative can do great things for the community, but if it doesn't make any money, then we can't say that it's successful. So we added another layer to the framework. This layer was about performance. This includes things like economic and financial viability, and active and total participation. It also includes things like leadership and women's empowerment. But if the cooperative isn't given the right soil to survive, then again, we can't say that it's successful. So we added a third layer to the framework of law and policy. And in this, we considered what factors in this environment enable a more successful environment for cooperatives. And these 3 things together, we suggest, lead to one key outcome: sustainable growth. This is achieving success for the cooperatives individually whilst at the same time allowing them to deliver on their development objectives for the broader community.
So we traveled to India to work with our client, International Cooperative Alliance, Asia Pacific Regional Office in New Delhi, and spent 1 week there meeting with key national stakeholders. And then we spent 1 week in 3 different locations outside New Delhi to look at our individual case studies. Bo went to Hyderabad, Telangana. Lauren went to Bangalore in Karnataka, and I went to Calicut and Patakara in Kerala. Our methodology mainly focused on collecting qualitative data through interviews, engagement, and meetings with over 70 cooperative members and about 35 other key stakeholders. We also supplemented our field study with desk research to look at existing literature in the field.
Let me now apply the compliance framework to present my findings for TASCAP, which is a federation of financial cooperatives with direct members of district-level cooperative central banks, or DCCBs. As requested by our client, ICA, our team developed a mapping tool to assess the cooperatives' compliance with the 7 principles. We incorporated the definition by ICA and came up with a framework of indicators, each followed by several variables, which also structured my interview questions. So take the 7th principle, concern for community, as an example. Social impact is included as an example, and it is measured based on, for example, whether the cooperative has social programs other than its cooperations, and whether they measure or track the impact of the programs. Then the framework was applied to these 3 case studies. The results are summarized into this dashboard with 21 variables mapped against the 3 case studies. The green blocks show satisfactory compliance, whereas the right ones indicate significant improvement is needed to ensure compliance. With an overview of these mapping results, our first finding is that the level of compliance with the 7 principles is not adequate, and even varies within one cooperative structure. Let me use 2 examples to explain the results. For education, training, and information, TASCAP and 2 DCCBs have very strong performance because they receive sufficient funding from the national development agencies. I also in Hyderabad had the chance to visit the campus of the Cooperative Training Institute, which offers comprehensive and tailored training programs for all employees and for all members. But the results also show, quite surprisingly, very weak performance of TASCAP in terms of concern for community. During the interviews, one narrative stands out that their organization and the cooperative itself has already been enough to benefit the community. And guided by that belief, most of their social activities lack clear and consistent targets or the intention to track the value for money of those programs. And as a result, relevant decisions are either micromanaged by a general body, such as whether to purchase furniture for school, or highly influenced by the personal judgment of the board of directors. So from this application, we can see the mapping tool is useful for identifying the weakness of compliance, but there's another barrier to address, which leads us to our second finding, that cooperatives usually regard their social mandates as a burden. From the interviews, the concern was quite evident that cooperatives would suffer financially if they took on social responsibilities as a cooperative bank. But there's potential synergy between their core services and development activities. Cooperatives need to build that capacity to leverage the synergy in order to sustain their growth. In the case of Karinagar DCCB, the PAC's development cell was able to bridge development funding and programs with the cooperative's core services as a bank. For example, it helped KDCCB secure funding for water development projects and diversification of agricultural activities for small farmers. And KDCCB also benefited financially because they served as a policy bank, whereas its commercial bank competitors didn't have such a development focus.
Okay, so we're now going to just zoom in on the second layer of performance, and I'm going to start by presenting some key findings on leadership and women's empowerment. So first to leadership. So a number of successful cooperatives that we met with in the field attributed their success to having good leaders. One cooperative we met with said that their success was dependent on one visionary leader who made the decision to diversify their services. Another cooperative we met with said that leadership is 100% a factor to success because it provides efficiency in decision making. But in these stories, we also discovered that cooperatives struggle to find good leaders. One cooperative said that good leaders are hard to find because incentives for good talent are not as available in the cooperative sector as they are in the private sector. When I spoke to the employees of the Federation that I visited in Karnataka, they said that they feel like their job security is at times threatened because so much of it depends on who the leader of the cooperative is. For them, one leader could make a decision to restructure and all of the employees would be out of a job. So from this we can see that good leadership practices enhance predictability of an organisation, but on the other hand, just having one fickle leader can destroy that. So this leads to our next finding, that whilst leadership is obviously an important criteria for success, there is an over-reliance on leaders as individuals to progress the movement forward. There's also a lack of incentives to develop talent. And to women's empowerment. So most of my fieldwork involved meeting with cooperative boards, and in most cases, women were either sidelined or marginalised in these sorts of meetings. In many cases, only men were sitting at the table and the women would sit behind the men. They literally didn't have a seat at the table. Where women were involved in the conversation, they only had very minor contributions to make. It is mandated in the cooperative legislation that each cooperative board has 2 women members on it. However, in a board of 15 to 21 people, 2 women is not that much. So from this we found that there is an underrepresentation of women on boards and weak women's engagement. So we saw from the story at the beginning of this presentation that cooperatives are an excellent vehicle for achieving some development objectives, but in this case, weak women's engagement is hindering those goals being met.
So I will now discuss the 2 other key performance areas, member participation and economic viability, and see what a successful cooperative that performs well in this area look like. I examined the Oralungar Labor Contract Cooperative Society, or ULCCS, which is a workers' cooperative that builds infrastructures like roads, bridges, schools, and other buildings. So on the area of participation, we found that there is an active and total participation in both membership and governance within ULCCS. So we brought in a definition of participation from just membership to governance. There is a strong evidence that participating in day-to-day management, also in decision-making of an organization, leads to better outcome. So we found that there are 2 types of motivations that motivate or inspire members to participate. So there are individualistic motivations and collectivist motivations. Under individualistic motivations include financial benefits, professional training, job security, and sense of achievement. On the other hand, collectivist motivation include shared or sense of community rather, shared goals and shared values. We found that collectivist motivation dominate individualistic motivations as far as how members participate in their cooperative. So this So ULCCS was born started as a social movement, and it started to fight against poverty, discrimination, and the caste system during its foundation in the early 1920s. And the members wanted, for them being able to help the community and continue the legacy as a social changer is already a great motivation for them. And so this showed that there should be a collective, more of a collective motivation for cooperatives to have a better outcome in participation. Moving on to governance, we found that there's strong commitment of members to participatory governance. So members are actively participating in governing in terms of making decisions, voting for directors. This is an important aspect. Also managing the daily operation within the cooperative. So unlike just membership, governance is a higher level participation because members are viewed as important constituents in the decision making within the cooperative, and they have a say on who run their organization and how it is run. Moving on to our economic viability finding, we found that revenue generation, cost reduction, capital access, and diversification are key to economic viability. ULCCS is performing well under these three areas. It has, the problem here is that problem of competition and inability to adapt to market shocks. And ULCCS was able to solve that by generating revenues. It has been consistently earning positive revenues. In addition, it has reduced its cost by owning the factors or the inputs of production that are really important in their construction business. Third, they were able to access capital. Private firms still view cooperatives as risky business. And so ULCCS has found a way to partner with cooperative banks within their area or community and obtain loans from them to fund their construction projects. And finally, ULCCS was able to diversify successfully into other industries outside of construction. So currently they have 3 major subsidiaries that is different from construction. So they are now providing services in technology, property management, education, as well as in social services as well. And so this findings show that ULCCS was able to find a way to become economically viable and to able to adapt to competition and also to become resilient in terms of economic conditions.
Okay, so just before we move on to the recommendations, we'll just take a quick look at the legal and policy framework. So I travelled to Karnataka to work with the Sustainably Federal Cooperative, which is a federation of what's called self-reliant cooperatives. So to explain that, the bulk of cooperatives in India are governed by the state government level. Each state has at least one act which regulates cooperatives, what they can and cannot do. But in some states, they've implemented a second parallel act called the Self-Reliant Act. So why have 2 acts? One key finding from our work was that governments have tended to involve themselves in the cooperative movement throughout their development. Governments since Nehru's time have sponsored the cooperative movement as a way for the country to develop. They've bought shares in cooperatives and put officials on the board to retain oversight. When I was in Karnataka, many members told me stories of how politicians would use cooperatives as a political platform to gain votes. One cooperative told a story of how they would be visited by a government-appointed auditor who would frequently engage in rent-seeking practices. The cooperative had no other choice but to accept the practices of this auditor because it was mandated for in the legislation. While some cooperatives welcome government involvement in the form of subsidies and grants, others see it as interference. It also breaches the key cooperative principle of autonomy. And so my work attempted to address some of these issues. The main elements of my findings included: the self-reliant model is a step in the right direction towards greater autonomy. For instance, in the scenario that I told you about auditing, the Sustainably framework provides for a panel of auditors, so one government, one appointed from the Federation, and one professional. So this, I guess, increases accountability and lessens the chance of rent-seeking practices. Secondly, there is scope for the model to be scaled to other states, but processes around financing and transition from the traditional act to the self-reliant act need to be strengthened. If a cooperative works with another cooperative which receives government grants, then that cooperative is restricted from joining the self-reliant movement. This limits access to finance and also prevent certain sectors, such as agricultural sectors, who receive a lot of government finance, from joining the self-reliant movement. Thirdly, it is necessary to have a federal body, but it isn't clear currently whether the powers in the Act go far enough, giving power to this federation. For instance, they don't have the power for registration and termination, because that sits with the government of Karnataka registrar at the moment. And finally, one act is better than two, but the framework is very susceptible to political will. So efficiencies can't be achieved between the two acts if some political parties are supporting the self-reliant movement and other political parties are supporting the traditional movement.
Here's a brief review of our findings. To conclude our presentation, we will make several recommendations for Indian cooperatives so that they can achieve their full potential and sustainable growth. So compliance with the 7 principles is still the foundation of the cooperative. To ensure compliance, we recommend that in the short term, cooperatives should use the mapping tool to conduct an assessment of their compliance with the 7 principles and identify the weak points and challenges. And secondly, cooperatives should, in the medium term, designate a specialized team or department in charge of strategic planning and evaluation of their development activities, and to align them with their core services. This could potentially leverage additional resources and funding available for development purposes.
So in the area of economic viability, we recommend to incorporate viability in cooperatives' business strategies. This could be achieved by ensuring that business strategies of cooperative focus on the key areas of revenue generation, cost reduction, capital access, and diversification. Outside industry professionals with business and management skills can be hired to lead these efforts. In the area of participation, we recommend to develop more platforms to encourage members to participate in government. This could be achieved by providing more training in governance and leadership to members who are interested. In addition, training should focus on women and younger members of the cooperatives.
So the area of leadership and women can be looked at through the lens of the social structure in India, which has a strong history of feudal and patriarchal practices. So recommendations are aimed at remedying some of those structural inconsistencies. So for leadership, the focus should be on strengthening leadership capacity, bolstering education and training. This can be used as an incentive to attract good talent, especially where financial capacity is lacking. For women, the recommendation is to increase the mandated quotas in the Act from 10% to 50%. This will target structural change. Establishing more women's-only cooperatives and allowing those cooperatives to coalition build will also help to increase the engagement and empowerment of women in the movement. For government interference, the recommendation is to bolster the self-reliant movement so that it can be effectively scaled to other states. This means strengthening the federal body, particularly around leadership and autonomy. Giving it power for registration and administration in the Act will help. It also means working towards one act instead of two. Having two acts cements the political patronage between the models and undermines the purpose of the self-reliant model.
So in conclusion, we recommend the focus to be on sustainable growth of cooperatives, which is inclusive of all the 3 levels of the framework: compliance with the 7 cooperative principles, cooperative performance, and legal and policy. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to welcoming your questions and comments.
Is there any from the plant?
Professor Pepper?
I thought this was really very, very interesting. And so I have just one specific question, if I could. I think it came up in your comments, Lauren. On the legislative policy thing, why wouldn't you just say keep government people off boards, because it violates the whole notion, as you said, it's not a cooperative under those circumstances, but that's just could be your
comment or a question?
What's that?
Is that a comment or a question? Shall I answer it?
Yeah, well,
Well, I mean, it's a good question. That's what I thought when I picked up the research brief as well. It's like, what is going on here? Why do they have a second act? But I think that's why I explained a little bit of the context and the history behind the movement, particularly in India, because they really, the government just after independence really did use the movement as a way for the country to develop. So that's why, from the government's perspective, they want to ensure that, particularly around sectors that deal in essential goods, such as the agriculture sector, the government really wants to ensure that it retains some control, some oversight around that area, and as a way to sort of support the movement in developing itself further.
So it was a political judgment about acceptability of the recommendation.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so anyway, that's good. The other thing I want to say is if you look at cooperatives as a form of organization, they have I think as your presentation showed clearly, they have an initial momentum. There's a movement part to it. There's some form of, in the broadest of senses, some form of market failure that they want to alter. But once that sort of initial reforming zeal moves ahead, the enemy becomes, I think, not loss of autonomy, but bureaucratization and management oligarchy, which I think you're beginning to see here. And that people, if you look at the BC ones, I mean, some of the largest cooperatives here, people wouldn't even know that they're co-ops on Fan City, for example, et cetera, et cetera. This is obviously in a very different context, but the same. Are you seeing that there in these kinds of things? Because they have to grow too, and as they grow, they have to be organized differently, and the way you were speaking about leadership and sort of revealed that. Do you see that general cycle being played out here?
In terms of that, it's really a hard balance, because if you do well and do too much on the economic and financial viability, then you're kind of bordering into the free market capitalist idea, which is not cooperative. And so I think it's striking that balance. In the other hand, cooperatives are viewed as organizations that provide all this really great social benefit and services to its community, but then if they don't have money, they can't afford to do that. And so from my experience, from my case study, they ventured out into diversification and grew really massively and become one of the biggest workers' cooperative in India. But then they have now this qualities of being, I would say, a free market capitalist firm, because they're gaining revenues, but at the same time they want to provide services to their communities. So I think in terms of governance, people are just kind of, they're trying to participate more in governing their own cooperatives rather than allowing outside, for example, professionals. They hire a lot of professionals that are not members of cooperatives to run their own cooperatives. And I think they're getting away with that by training all of their members to become really good leaders and taking all this leadership position within their cooperatives.
We have a question from the panel.
Mohit Dev from the International Cooperative Alliance. So Mohit says, hi, thanks for having us here. Happy to see both Lauren and Reagan presenting their findings and suggesting recommendations. In general, we thought the presentation had come up pretty well, especially given the time constraints on field for the researchers. The information captured is relevant and can be developed further, maybe by the next batch of participants from UBC. We had a few specific questions and recommendations for UBC to consider. So there's 4 questions to follow. Reagan, how do you propose to facilitate the development of member-centric platforms that will encourage more members to participate in the governance structure of worker cooperatives?
For participation, I think it's important to look at the needs of the members and their willingness and their interest in the decision-making process. In my case study, all the members were really interested and they want to have a say in all the decisions in terms of especially approving or rejecting all these construction projects or even venturing into other industries. And I think just hearing their voice, making sure that that the management go out there and ask for a consensus, and I think that's what members want, is for them to be really ask and comment and provide ideas to these suggestions. And I think that's one way to improve that that issue, is to make sure that all of this, all the members have the ability to either vote or to express their concerns by talking to the management without fear of retaliation or any sort. And so I think that's one some of the ways to address that.
Over to Lauren. Karnataka is the only state in India to have implemented a federal body to oversee the self-reliant cooperatives. Is a federal body necessary? Can a federal body ever be in a position where it will have all the same powers as a government registrar, or is it always restricted to relying on the government?
Oh, such a good question. So, yes, my recommendation is that a federal body is necessary. I did a little bit of a comparison with another state, which I didn't include in the presentation today, which was Andhra Pradesh, which also has a self-reliant model but no federation. And so it's unclear, even just from an administrative point of view, whether how many self-reliant cooperatives they have there, how they're recording all of this information, and whether they're successful or not, whether they exist or not. It's just difficult from an administrative point of view to sort of understand the numbers around that. The Federation also serves a really vital purpose, I think, in sort of encouraging and empowering the cooperatives within the movement, which I think is a really crucial aspect. And also another element is in coalition building. It provides a forum for these cooperatives to come together and work together, which is really the essence of the cooperative movement, to lobby for change or to express that, government interference isn't necessarily what we want in our cooperative. What was the last bit of the question? Around will it ever have the powers of a government? I don't know. I'm aware of a type of organisation which is called a self-regulatory organisation, an SRO, which I understand can mimic the types of powers that a government would have, which I think in this case would allow it to have power for registration and termination, which is what the government has under the Act. Whether that's a viable possibility or not, I guess I need to do more research.
And both. TSCAB could benefit from establishing a specialized department responsible for the management and strategic planning of social programs. How exactly? Was there evident need?
During my interviews with the general manager from TSCAB, she mentioned when I was doing my interview questions, she was kind of inspired by my ideas to have to build more capacity around cooperative system, social responsibility, or general sustainability department or development office. So the need is quite evident, and TSCAB as the apex bank of the hierarchy structure, they definitely have the resources and to deliver more development objectives in that regard. Could you repeat the first part of the question?
TSCAB could benefit from establishing a specialized department responsible for the management and strategic planning of social programs. So how exactly?
So with the most cost-effective way, I think with the tax development cell already there, we can build on that capacity instead of starting anew to save cost. And so the tax development cells only on the DCCB level, and the TSCAB could benefit to leverage that ability to the highest level.
And a general couple comments to finish. The ICA-UBC partnership could seek to provide a framework for young policy researchers to join hands with emerging co-ops, empathize with their struggles, and connect with their aspirations. We may explore options to institutionalize this engagement if there's commitment from the researchers to follow up and build upon the findings into a constructive policy dialogue. Select interns from UBC with actionable engagement can also be absorbed as ICA fellows. All right.